Welcome to Kingdom Animalia. In this video, we're just going to introduce some common characteristics found in animals, as well as talk briefly about the evolution of animals, or where scientists think that this evolution began. So for the common characteristics, there's a lot of common characteristics in our animals, and the characteristics listed are not unique to animals, and I'll tell you examples about those soon. So the characteristics we're going to use, while they might not be unique to animals, animals have all of those characteristics. So fungi might be described by some of them, or plants might be described by some of them, but by having all of these characteristics, that's how we know that we are talking about animals. So the two that pop up on this screen is that animals are both diploid and they're multicellular. So let's talk about multicellularity first. So animals are not protists, particularly protozoa. Remember, protozoans are protists that are heterotrophic, that they consume other things. Now animals, and we'll talk about that more soon, animals are also heterotrophic, but the reason a protist is a protist is because it was unicellular. But when we talk about multicellular organisms, that's where we're no longer a protist and now we're an animal. So the number of cells really is going to depend on the organism. It could be trillions upon trillions, or it could be just a small handful. But regardless, still more than one cell. Thinking about our plants, we've learned before that plants kind of go through this alternation of generations. Even fungi have diploid and haploid structures. But when it comes to animals, they're diploid. The only thing that is haploid are the gametes, whereas in our other kingdoms, we see that there's more haploid and diploid stages. But again, in our animals, every part of the life cycle is diploid except those gametes. Another characteristic that I mentioned earlier is that we are heterotrophic, so animals have to consume other things, whether it's plants, animals, decaying matter, etc., in order to get their energy. This is similar to fungi, but as I mentioned earlier, fungi have kind of this haploid structure, the mycelium, which is why they're not considered the same thing. Again, there's other characteristics as well, but thinking about these major ones. And then finally, this is something else that defines Animalia different from fungi is motility. So being able to move. Now the amount of movement's really going to depend. I mean, here we have a cheetah, thinking about one of the fastest land animals. But you might have things like sponges that we're going to explore more in a little bit. Sponges, for the most part, are sessile, or they stay still or in the same place, but there's a whole lot of movement happening if we were to look closer at the cellular level. So there's definitely movement going on. But if you think about algae, plants, even fungi, really the only movement that we see is growth. Whereas in animals, they're actively moving, and one of those reasons is because they are heterotrophic. So again, while these characteristics may not be unique to animals, animals are going to exhibit all four of these characteristics, whereas our other kingdoms, such as fungi, plants, protists, they might have some of these, but not all of them. Finally, let's just talk a little bit about the evolution of animals. So the evolution of animals is fairly recent in our evolutionary history. And what scientists think is that we were derived from organisms that were living in the oceans. Life in general started in the oceans. Being able to get water readily was really important and helped a lot with a lot of biological processes. We've already talked about the evolution of plants onto land, and they had to face a lot of trials and tribulations in order to survive on land. And animals, it's really no different. So we think the first animals evolved in water, and particularly looking at protozoans, or protists that are more animal-like. So our very first animals that we're going to explore in this unit is our sponges, or phylum Porifera. Sponges, very, very kind of primitive animals, but it does have all of the characteristics that we talked about before. Sponges have these specialized cells called choanocytes. And that's what this kind of orangey figure is here. So sponges themselves, you can think of like that soft, squishy sponge, and these choanocytes are lining that sponge. And these choanocytes are the ones that do the feeding, they're the ones that do the filtering, they're the ones moving water. Like this is the live part of a sponge. Now, scientists have looked at this protist. There's a protist called a choanoflagellate, and that's kind of represented in this blue here on the left, and also in this microscope image on the top. And scientists have noticed that there is a striking resemblance between this protist, the choanoflagellate, and these specialized cells in sponges, the choanocyte. And by similarity, we don't mean just structure, but also function. The way the choanoflagellate itself lives and feeds and moves is nearly identical to choanocytes. So what scientists think is that as a protist, remember protists are unicellular, that a choanoflagellate just was existing. And it might have been around other choanoflagellates. When it comes to reproduction, this isn't shocking. A lot of unicellular or even multicellular organisms are usually found near each other. And what scientists think is that groups of choanoflagellates being around each other and passing hormones or chemical signals to each other, they may have started making a material that either bound them together or provided some sort of defensive mechanism. Whatever this material was, it was helping choanoflagellates that existed near each other to survive better and more than those that were solo. And so evolution and natural selection was selecting for choanoflagellates that were grouping together. Times this by a couple 100 million years, and what you start seeing is this association found within these choanoflagellates that essentially come to what we see as sponges today. The sponge material, that soft part, isn't alive. It's a protein matrix. So it's very possible that these original choanoflagellates were making this protein matrix just individually and stimulating more of it around others. And again, you pass these traits on over generation and generation, that choanoflagellate is no longer to exist by itself, that it must have other choanoflagellates in order to survive. So it's a pretty cool relationship. And again, it started here with our sponges, just with these simple protists, and then from there really blossoming and really expanding. Now, I'll admit, in this course, we're not going to explore too much more about animal evolution. We're definitely going to talk more about the different groups of animals, from our worms, for our dolphins and our insects and our clams. We're going to talk about a lot of them, but honestly, you could spend a whole course just learning about how did we go from sponges, common ancestor, to coral reefs. So it's a really interesting field, and I encourage you to explore it more. So again, in order to be an animal, you have to be diploid, you've got to be heterotrophic, you've got to be motile, so you have to move, and you have to be multicellular. There are more characteristics of animals, but we're just going to keep it simple with those four. Having all four of those means you're probably an animal. We think our animals evolved from protists called choanoflagellates. They were heterotrophic, just like humans are, but just like animals are. And we think those that were in close association with each other were benefiting and passing that genes to the next generation until we got our multicellular sponges, which we're going to explore more later on in this unit.